Number 1. Search. When I was growing up and living in the suburbs, it was always my plan to move into the city when I was old enough. I didn't learn to drive a car and took trains and buses everywhere I went. There didn't seem to be any point to having a car, and living in the city, when all having a car would do is cost you even more money and cause difficulty for parking and such. Things weren't really great at home with my parents. They were the sort who said things that made you really believe they wanted their kids out of their house as soon as possible. They didn't encourage me to go to college or anything like that, and I didn't ever make plans to do so. My life basically had me moving out when I was forced to, and then probably working at a fast food or retail job for a long time. I graduated a semester early simply because I could, so that also meant that since I wasn't going to college, I had to start looking for a place to live. The semester finals were over in January, so that is when I would start looking. I lived outside of a large northern city, so the winter was going to be very rough, and it was going to be difficult to be looking for a place to live in the city. I had a job working in the suburbs. I was going to do the opposite of what most people did. People tended to live in the suburbs and work in the city. However, I had seen the fast food and retail places in the city, and I had no desire to work in them. So I wanted to live there, but I planned on keeping my job in the suburbs. Plus, going backwards against rush hour on the trains would be a pleasant experience. I immediately found it really difficult finding a place to live. I was an 18-year-old high school graduate with no credit history or living references. I didn't want to get a roommate. I wanted to find a studio apartment and live by myself. This made finding a place even more difficult, but I kept looking for one. I had an appointment to look at a studio in a building a little further north than I wanted to live. The building was also very old and in a not-so-great part of town, so I wasn't really sure that I wanted to live there. However, I told the building manager that I would think about it, and that I would get back to him. At that point, it was dark outside. It was very, very cold outside, and it had started snowing when I began walking back to the train station. I was trying to save as much money as possible for moving, so I didn't take a bus back to the train station. It would be a bit of a walk, but the cold and the snow didn't really bother me at all. Since I was pretty far north in the city, and it was snowing pretty hard outside at that point, there weren't a lot of people around. It was one of the reasons I considered not wanting to move there, because I wanted to be around people. I walked under the tunnel that was there before getting to the train station, and there was some guy who was leaning up against the wall under there. When he saw me, I could tell he was going to say something to me, which made me uncomfortable. I didn't like when people I didn't know on the street talked to me. Well, I thought he was going to ask me for some change, and I would have given him some. I had my hand in my pocket in order to get some. However, the guy asked me if I wanted to buy some weed off of him, and I was caught off guard. At the time, I didn't smoke the stuff, so I made an awkward comment, turning him down. It seemed like my awkward comment offended him, though. He got really angry at me, really quickly, and started accusing me of disrespecting him. I tried to ignore him and just went on my way, but that only seemed to make him even angrier at me. I was beginning to get scared and just wanted to get up to the train station. The drug dealer demanded I stop and come back to him. I really thought that the best thing I could do was just ignore him, but I was really wrong. That only got him angrier at me. The guy grabbed me from behind, shocking me, and pushed me up against the wall of the tunnel. It was then that I realized that he had a knife on him. He held me against the wall with the knife, talking about how I disrespected him. I denied doing so, telling him that I only wanted to get to the train and get home because it was so cold outside. However, That didn't seem to convince him, and he was seriously angry at me. I still don't know what I would have done if suddenly 3 people had not turned the corner and were walking under the tunnel. The drug dealer very quickly hid the knife back in his coat and moved away from me. He actually took the moment to move towards the 3 men, I assumed to try and sell them some weed or something. I knew I was thrown a lifeline and I took it. I quickly moved out of the tunnel and up the stairs to the train station. I went inside the small station, which had an attendant, so I was relatively sure that I would be safe there. When the train eventually came, the drug dealer was on the platform watching me. I thought he was going to get on the train too, but he didn't. However, he watched me as I sat down at the window and showed me his knife as the train sped away. Needless to tell you, I didn't take that apartment. Number 2. Walk. After my parents got divorced, I really disliked being with my dad. My dad and mom still lived in the same neighborhood, although not really too close together. I spent most of the time with my mom, although I had a room at both of their houses. My dad had gotten really depressed after the divorce. He spent a lot of the time that I was with him drinking, and not really paying too much attention to me. I only spent the occasional weekend over at his place, and only when he insisted on it. And since I was spending Christmas with my mom, he insisted that I spend the weekend before Christmas over at his place, so my parents arranged that. I was 10 years old at the time. I think that's important to know if you are to understand some of the decisions that I made in this story. It was a pretty lousy day, ever since I walked home from school to my dad's house. It had been snowing pretty heavily all day, so walking to the house caused my feet to get pretty soaked because of the snow. Once I had arrived at my dad's place, he had already began drinking, so the night wasn't going so great. The only thing that I liked was the fact that it was snowing outside, so I sat in the window, drinking hot chocolate, and watching the snow fall. Well, my dad drank so much that he eventually fell asleep in his easy chair. This wasn't unusual, but it made the night as bad as any other. I was only 10, and I really didn't know what to do, being in the house basically by myself. It wasn't the first time that I completely had to take care of myself, but I didn't really care for it. It seemed like I was wasting my time and my night being at his house. That's when I got the brilliant idea that I should just walk over to my mom's house. I had made the walk before, and it was a bit of a long walk. I also wasn't supposed to be out so late at night. I also thought that my mom might be asleep or out of the house, but I couldn't stand spending more time in this house with my passed-out father. I bundled up as best I could with what I had in the house. Then I set out into the snow. It had really been snowing hard, and it had been building up on the ground. That made it much harder walking out there than it had walking from school, but I was determined to make it back to my mom's house. I was moving really slowly through the snow. As I walked by each streetlight, I saw how hard and heavy the snow was falling. A few times I felt like I should turn around and go back to my dad's house, but I figured it would be fine when I finally made it home. I had gotten maybe about halfway when something happened. A door opened and an older man came out on the porch. He started talking to me from a distance, asking me if I wanted to come into his house to get warm. He said it was way too cold and wet out there, and if I came into his house, he could call my father for me to come and pick me up. I waved him off, telling him I was fine. I was just trying to get home and I could make it there on my own. That was when he started offering me things like hot chocolate and fudge if I came into the house. He was making me feel uneasy because I wasn't supposed to talk to adults that I didn't know. I wish that I could have walked faster, but I would have had to walk in the street for that, and I wasn't allowed to do that either. I wanted to get away from him because I didn't feel good with him talking to me. I didn't like talking to strangers. When I tried to go on, I noticed him from the corner of my eye. The man began coming down his front walk quickly, coming right at me. I didn't think too much about it, but I got scared out of my wits when he grabbed me by the arm. He started trying to pull me towards the front walk, and I knew he was trying to get me into his house. I was terrified, and I struggled my best to get away from him. I began screaming out and yelling at him to let me go, but the guy was dragging me, and since he was a lot bigger than me, he was winning. There was no doubt that he was going to get me into his house. I got extremely lucky, however, as a snowplow was coming down the street at the time. It caught the attention of the man dragging me. I was able to use the icy slickness of the sidewalk to knock him off balance and onto his butt. Then I jumped over the snowbank, separating the sidewalk from the road, and in front of the snowplow. The man who had grabbed me got up and started running back towards the house. The snowplow stopped and a big man got out of the cab. I ran over to him and told him that the man in the house tried to abduct me and asked him if he could help me out. The driver let me into his truck and he used his phone to call the cops. He waited in front of the house until they arrived, which took a while, but when they arrived they went and confronted the man in the house. He was arrested for attempting to abduct me. The police then took me home to my mom's house. I did get in some trouble for attempting the walk in the first place. Mostly my parents were both happy that nothing bad had happened to me. That was the closest call I ever had in my life. Number 3. Friendship. I used to have this friend named Dan who was a lot like me. He was sort of a dark guy, wore all black all the time, kept his apartment dark all the time, and tended to spend an awful lot of his time by himself. I don't actually recall how the two of us started talking and eventually became friends, because we weren't really the social types. But however it happened, we became pretty good friends. Though we were close in age, Dan hadn't really gone through as much as I had in life. I'd been in relationships both good and bad. He really had spent the most of his time alone. I seem to think that maybe we met on a dating site or something like that, and then just decided to become friends. He had met someone on the site about 6 months after the two of us became friends, and he became enamored with them. However, his newfound love was pretty obvious to me as a game player. They lived in different states, first off. Whenever Dan tried to figure out a way for them to get together, it never worked. It was really just a bunch of drama, and I really couldn't tell Dan what I thought, though, because I knew that he would just get mad at me. However, the day that it all came to a head was on the day where there was a blizzard. My job shut down pretty early in the afternoon and canceled the following day of work because of the feet of snow that were expected. So I drove through a lot of heavy falling snow to get home and was planning on not stepping foot out of the door for the next few days. It was pretty late in the evening, around 11 p.m., when I got a call from Dan. I hadn't heard from him a lot lately because he was so into his significant other. He was so distressed on the phone and I could barely make out what he was talking about. However, he kept pleading with me to come over to his place because he didn't trust himself to be alone. I definitely didn't want to go out into the blizzard, but, of course, I had no problem doing it for a friend. It was difficult to get over to Dan's place. The snow was falling even heavier than before, and it was hard to see anything at all. He didn't live very far from me, but it took me nearly until midnight to get to his place. And when I made it there, things began to make a lot more sense. The person he was supposedly in love with had been playing some pretty sick games with him, although Dan couldn't see it that way. They were supposed to drive up to see Dan for the weekend, but claimed they had driven halfway and then couldn't drive anymore. They went as far as telling him that they were going to kill themselves in the car because they were so upset that they couldn't finish the trip and come and see him. Dan offered to go and find them and pick them up, but they eventually hung up and quit answering their phone. So Dan and I were, as usual, hanging out in the dark in his apartment. And there was this extremely strong negative energy in the air. And I was doing all I could as a friend, simply to console my friend, despite all the bad mojo that he had surrounded himself in. Eventually, although it was hard, I was able to get Dan to calm down, just enough that he dozed off for a while. I was laying in his bed, watching over him when he fell asleep. Once that happened, I just laid there in the dark, looking at the snow falling outside. I wasn't the type who could usually fall asleep in anyone else's bed, but I had to be there for my friend. So I just lay there, watching the snow, as he slept beside me. I thought that I heard something in another part of the apartment. I didn't think it was anything at first. However, as I was lying there, several things happened at once that really terrified me more than I had ever been scared before. Suddenly, a light in the hallway outside Dan's bedroom turned on. I immediately looked over there from the window. I turned my head just in time to see the shadow of someone walking by the doorway into the living room of the apartment. I'm not sure how long I lay there, frozen in terror. Someone had broken into Dan's apartment, but I couldn't figure out how it had happened, and I didn't know how to handle the problem either. Dan woke up and he was groggy, asking me if I turned the light on. I told him no, and that I had been in bed the entire time. I thought someone was in the apartment, and that I would go and check it out. The light suddenly turned off. I'm not sure if it was because everything that Dan had been through that night, but he immediately decided to take care of the issue. He got up, walked out of the room, and turned the hallway light on. Then he walked into the living room, and he was gone for a little while. I was breathing heavy as I waited for something to happen next. I expected to hear some sign of a struggle or some kind of violence. However, I didn't hear anything at all, but it was nerve-wracking waiting. Finally, Dan came back into the room. He turned the hallway light off and then came into the room and sat down on the bed. After a moment, he told me that not only was no one in the house, but the bolt on his door was locked. That meant that if someone had been in the apartment, they couldn't have just left because they couldn't lock the bolt once they had left. I think if Dan hadn't seen the light turn off after he'd woke up, he might have thought that I had turned the light on myself, but he witnessed it turning off and was just as confused as I was at first. However, after we allowed ourselves some time to process it, and after Dan realized that his significant other had just been playing him the entire time, he recognized that there was a lot of negative energy in his apartment that night. So he thought that perhaps that negativity had manifested into something supernatural. I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, I saw the shadow of someone walking into the living room. I was sure that someone had to have been in the apartment that night. I even wondered if they possibly may have gone out through the balcony somehow. However, there were no footprints or anything in the snow there. Neither of us had any real idea what we witnessed that night, but whatever it was incredibly scary for the both of us. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.